Okay, well, it's time to configure HelpCounter and get it set up for your volunteers to start signing in and signing out. This is actually a pretty quick process. It'll probably take about 15 or 20 minutes, depending upon interruptions. Okay, there are 4 steps. Step 1 is setup and preferences, and that's where we'll get it properly configured for your school, and that's probably the longest step. It'll take a few minutes. Okay, step number 2 is to enter some or all of your volunteers. This will be a step so that your volunteers, when they come to sign in, they can find their name and click on it. Now, if you're just getting started for the first time and you have a spreadsheet with all of your volunteers on it, we can import that for you and get you started a lot faster. And then once the import's done, you can add individual volunteers yourself as they come in. Okay, step number 3, rather. Enter your committees and activity names. And this will be very quick. Just the names of things that people can sign into, like the Fall Carnival or the library help, that sort of thing. And then the last step is to enter the classrooms, step number 4. Now, in middle schools, we sometimes use just the names of halls or houses because it's kind of rare that volunteers sign into classrooms in middle school, and especially not in high school. So in high school, generally just a couple of generic classroom names is all we need. But again, it's a pretty quick step, just entering the names of classrooms. So there you go, 4 quick steps, and HelpCounter will be ready for your volunteers. So let's get going. Step number 1, setup and preferences. So the first thing to do is to log into HelpCounter at helpcounterweb.com and go to the admin area. So in this case, it's demo-adm. And then the password. Now, in the admin area, we're going to go to Setup and Preferences. So we choose Setup and Preferences, and then the first one is Main Setup. So first there's the Names section. These are the names that will show on the sign-in screen when your volunteers come to sign in. So you can see that the name of the school is at the top of the screen here, and then it's Home of the Mighty Dolphins. That's the mascot. That's the mascot that you'll choose. Okay, then address defaults, city, state, and zip code. If you use street addresses in your in keeping track of volunteers, which more and more fewer schools do this because they communicate almost exclusively by email. But if you do want to keep track of physical street addresses, you can set defaults here. And then milestones. Milestones are these acknowledgments that volunteers get when they cross certain hours boundaries, like in this case 15, 20, 40, etc. So what will happen is if a volunteer is signing out and they cross that 15-hour plateau, the program will pop up a little congratulatory message saying, "Congratulations, you just passed 15 hours. We appreciate all you do." It's really a nice thing to do. But then it's going to also send you an email letting you know that this volunteer just passed the milestone. You'll be aware of this, they'll be aware of this, and then you can set 6 levels of milestones. Set them according to your own school's needs. Because at some schools you may want to start at 5 hours, but at some schools you may not need to until 40. Now, the grade levels. That's the earliest grade and highest grade. Miscellaneous. There's some pretty important stuff here. You can enable the Spanish sign-in if you'd like. Under miscellaneous here, you go to, by checking that box. This will put a Espanol button on the sign-in screen, so your volunteers can sign in and out in Spanish. You can also enable the visitor sign-in button and the student sign-in button. Those are optional. You can have just a visitor button, or you can have the other two. Now, the sign-in buttons will determine which buttons show on the sign-in screen. Now, the only one that has to be there is the volunteer sign-in or sign-out button. But if you want to use HelpCounter to track your visitors, to replace your visitor log, you can enable the visitor button. And you can also use it to eliminate the student late arrival and early departure log and add the student button here. So those are optional. The only thing that has to be there is the volunteer button. You select which buttons you'd like to have there by choosing them on the setup and preferences. Now, this one that says the number of days before auto sign out. Okay, what'll happen is sometimes volunteers will come in, they'll sign in, and then they'll forget to sign out. They'll just leave. Okay. Now, what you're setting here is a grace period, basically. So if the volunteer returns within this grace period, in this case 8 days, they'll see a message that says, last time you were here, you forgot to sign out. And it'll just remind them what they were doing and ask them how long they volunteered. And they can actually finish the sign-in right then and there. Now, if they don't come back in within the grace period here, overnight, the program on the 8th day will average their time on that activity and just go ahead and sign them out. And if they've never done that activity before, it'll take an average of all volunteers in your school. But anyway, it's pretty handy because volunteers will sometimes forget to sign out. But 8 days is a pretty good time to Allow them to come back in. It's over a week. The next one down, when creating a new school year data file, this is going to help you go from school year to school year. Now, you can set it to carry forward all volunteers, or you can set it to skip any volunteers who didn't actually do anything, didn't volunteer. This is kind of a nice way to help keep your database clean, because it won't keep carrying volunteers forward from one school year to the next school year to the next school year if they haven't volunteered, if they haven't done anything. You can also set it to skip volunteers who graduated their last child, or you can see the different combinations. Or you can set it to just not carry forward any volunteers. Start over from scratch every year. Okay, we'll scroll on down now and we'll look at data restrictions. The show student data and track unique students. I recommend both those be checked if you're going to have student data in there. Now, some schools choose not to have student data at all. And if you uncheck that box, all the information about students, that information just won't show if you uncheck that. Tracking unique students simply means that students can only, a name of a student can only exist in the system once. So if you have two students with the same name, one of them will have to have a middle initial or something like that. And this is kind of handy because this will allow you to actually assign the same student to two different guardians, mom and dad. It's kind of a confusing thing, but it'll make sense if you start actually working with the volunteer profiles and setting up students. But be aware this is where that setting is done. That's really what we need to know now. And then show the volunteer addresses. Some schools just don't even track street addresses. So uncheck that and it won't even show in the volunteer profiles. Same with emergency contacts. They're optional. You can have emergency contacts with volunteers. Check it or uncheck it. And over time, you'll figure out if that's something you want in there or not. But just be aware now that this is where you set it. Okay. Allow home access for volunteers and block access for those designated as inactive. Now, this is the section where your volunteers could log in from home, not into the areas that you've seen, not into an admin area or volunteer screen, but to a separate home access screen where they would have just access to their own information, and that's it. They can't see anybody else's information. And that's set up with the home access links that we can get into. And that's kind of an advanced feature, so not really something we want to cover today. But again, be aware, this is where you set it, and this is where you would allow that. Now, background checks. This is real important. If you're going to have the program track and enforce background checks, this is where you set that. Now, be aware, we're not talking about actually running the background checks. We're talking about just tracking them. So if you run the background check wherever you run them, you can record that information here. Now, if you add it, you can set it to edit only, and you can start putting in background check information. And here's what that looks like in the volunteer's profile. Now, we're not going to get into this in detail right now. Again, the idea here is just to let you know that this is where you control whether or not you are tracking background checks. And the settings are not at all. Edit only, which means that you can start putting the information in, and then require, meaning that the information's been put in and they have to have a current background check or they can't sign in. Volunteer self-add mode, there's an option for volunteers to put their own information in the database if they're brand new. Let's show you what that looks like. That would be here on the sign-in screen, and so I'm a volunteer. I can click on this button, and if I'm not in the database, I can click on this yellow button down here, and I can add my own information. Now, you may or may not want this to be available to them, and so once they do enter their information, they're now in the database, and they can sign in and sign out. And the next time they come in, their name will be there too. Now, it will automatically go away if you set the program to enforce background checks, because there's not a way for them to add themselves and have a complete background check at the same time. Okay, on the right-hand side here, badge printing. That is if you want HelpCounter to print badges for your volunteers and visitors, and those look like this. Here's a typical volunteer badge, and we can customize it somewhat to your specific needs. This one even includes the barcode, so that if you have a barcode reader, the volunteer can sign out by just taking their badge off and putting it in front of the scanner. One thing to note is that typically the settings and configuration can be done on your computer. This one setting has to be done on the same computer as the printer is connected to, the same computer the printer is connected to. And then the last section on the right here is the display options. So here are the activities listed, and I've got them set here in multiple columns. Now, some schools have these activity names that are really, really long, and they won't fit in multiple columns. If that's the case, just select one column and you'll have the full screen width to display your activity names. But I think 3 columns generally works better. And then the last thing here is the webcam. Now, you can hook up a webcam and have it take pictures of your visitors and volunteers and actually store that so that when you go to look at the screens on who's in the building, you'll see their picture next to their name. And you can actually even have it print on the badges if you like. So we can cover that in detail later, but this is where you would configure that. For now, I would say don't check these. Let's just get the program up and running, and then let's look at adding these other features later. So click Save Changes on the lower left here, and you're done with Setup and Preferences. Whew, that was the longest one right there. You got through it. Okay, so step 2, add some volunteers. The next 3 steps are going to involve adding data, so they're all going to be done under this View and Edit Data tab. Okay, so click on View and Edit Data, and then Volunteer Profiles. Now, your list is probably going to be empty. So what we want to do is just click on Add a New Volunteer, and we enter their name. And this is going to be Mark Test, and then click Add this volunteer. Now, there's obviously a lot of other information we can put in here, and probably the most important other piece to put in is their email address, because the program relies on email so much for communicating with volunteers and giving them home access, etc. So, but for now, all we absolutely have to have is the volunteer name. So you put in their name, save their changes, and move on. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you have a list of volunteers in a spreadsheet, you can send that to us and we'll import it. And that's a really good way to kickstart your application here. So that's your volunteers. The next step is to add some committees or activities. So we go back to View and Edit Data, Individual Activities and Committees. And again, your list will be empty at this point. So we click Add a New Activity and type in the activity name. Again, there's a lot of stuff we could put in here, but for now, we're just trying to get the program up and running for your volunteers, right? So we just want to just get this stuff in and get it ready. So we'll just type in the name. And then the last step, step 4, is classrooms, individual classrooms. So again, we come back to View and Edit Data, Individual Classrooms. So we click Add a New Classroom and type in the, basically, usually it's the teacher name. We could type in the grade and email address, but for now we're just going to put the names in. Now, some schools will use different names for their classrooms. They'll have actual names for the classrooms rather than the teacher names. And one thing I mentioned earlier too is, say for example, in a high school, you don't want to put in all the classrooms if volunteers are never volunteering in a classroom. So you could put in a name like, high school. I just recommend do classroom generic volunteering. See, that way there's something in there, so if your volunteers actually click on they're going to help in a classroom, there will be something there to click on. So there you go. That's all you need to do, those 4 steps. And once you've done that, you can go back to your, go over to your, the sign-in computer, the computer your volunteers are going to sign in on. Go to helpcounterweb.com, enter the user ID and password for the sign-in area on that computer, and you're set. There's a lot more we can do. There's a lot of advanced features we'll cover in future videos, but for now, this will get you going, and your volunteers can start signing in and signing out right now.